Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. My name is Trini Dalton, and we are really excited to launch the Distinguished Visiting Writers Series at Cal State East Bay for fall and spring. These are lunchtime talks that will happen monthly, and we have a wonderful launch event today with author and friend Hasanthika Sirisena, also known as Hasi. And I wanted to introduce her as she will be reading for us this afternoon. We can do a Q&A together, and we are so excited to have this time with her, given her busy schedule, and she's been doing digital readings. It seems like every day almost. You've been doing a lot of events here. So let me show you. I'm going to put on my party hat, because if we were together, I would give you this. I have a party hat I'm going to wear today for you, and I'm going to mail you this beautiful party hat. And look at this. Look at this, everyone. Look at the top. These are party hats from the 1930s, I was told. Wow. And we're welcoming Hasanthika Sirisena. So let's give her a round of applause. We can take it off mute and clap if we want to. Do it. Let's do it. She's a wonderful butterfly in our world. And this is my other new signage. I'm still working on this sign. This is the Cal State East Bay English Department and Creative Writing Department's Distinguished Visiting Writers Series launch for fall, moving into spring, lunchtime talks, which are free and open to the public. They're free and open to the public. We're going to pretend we have party hats, everybody here. And we have Hasanthika Sirisena. Next up in December, we'll have Anne Davila Cardinal. And then in February, we'll have Alice and Adele Hedgecock. In March, we have Achio Bejas. And in April, we have Tomas Morin, Q Morin, who's a poet, and he has a memoir coming out, which is very exciting. And today we're welcoming Hasi. Hasanthika Sirisena's work has been anthologized in This Is the Place from Seal Press, in Everyday People, The Color of Life, Atria Books, which is on our recommended reading list for fiction. This is a great anthology. We've got it on our fiction list this semester, and twice named a notable story by Best American Short Stories. She's received fellowships from MacDowell and Yaddo and is a Rona Jaffe Writers Award recipient. She's currently faculty at the Vermont College of Fine Arts and Susquehanna University, and she is acting editor at West Branch Magazine. That's Bucknell, right? Is that Bucknell? Yeah, okay. And an editor at 713 Books. Her short story collection, The Other One, won the Juniper Prize and was released in 2016 by the University of Massachusetts Press. And her forthcoming essay collection, Dark Tourist, won the 2020 Gournay Prize and is forthcoming from Mad Creek Press through Ohio State University. And I have had the pleasure of listening to mostly essay. I think I've heard some short stories of hers, but Hasanthika has been working on essays for the past few years, and I have been hearing snippets of Dark Tourist it will be an exceptional book, as are her short stories. So let's give her a warm welcome and listen to a reading this afternoon while you settle in with snacks. And I'm going to work on this gigantic bottle of kombucha. So big. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome.
Thank you for being here, everybody. I know that people are dealing with, this semester has been I thought this semester would be better, and this has been just as grueling as the last 2 semesters in so many ways, and I know that must be the case for you. So I really appreciate you being here and your attention. I am actually going to read, I am going to, in sort of honor of Trini's amazing art, and not trying to compare myself to Trini, but I'm going to actually read from a comic. This comic was actually published in Electric Literature, but I don't love how Electric Literature laid it out. So I'm going to read from my, and I think it's just easier to follow on the screen if I do how I originally wanted it laid out. But I put the link up there to the Electric Literature if you want to take a look at what they did. And this essay is about my experience losing my first language. And I did the drawings, you can see from the title. I did the drawings and the and I also wrote the script. And I can talk a bit more about doing comics if people are interested. So this is Ghost Language, Art and Words by moi. Okay. A year and a half after my mother's death, I was driving home. Okay, and everybody can see this clearly, right? Is that, sorry, you know, yeah, I see people nodding. Okay. A year and a half after my mother's death, I was driving home with my father when he suddenly spoke to me in Sinhala. Api gadara kata karana terana. What? My father hadn't spoken to me in my native language since I was 6 years old. And I always thought he was disappointed in me, but that he'd forgotten I once spoke it. I think this was some sort of test, maybe because I was surprised, or maybe because I was also embarrassed. It took me too long to understand what he was saying. He became quiet. I'd missed an important opportunity. When I was 6, my English teacher asked my parents to stop speaking to me in my first language. Well, Mrs. Sirisena, she's very quiet in class. The writer, A.M. Deloso, in her story English as a Second Language, writes about what it was like at the time. The assimilation was a savage process which forced us to prove between the brutalities of the useful and the useless. Useful, English, French, Spanish, Italian, Arabic, Russian, until 1990, Mandarin Chinese. That was useful. Useless, almost all of the 6,492 other languages spoken in the world. My mother still sometimes spoke to me in Sinhala. Oya tamalasti nate. I'm ready. Even though I understood, I wouldn't speak it. This hurt her most when strangers asked why she hadn't taught me. She speaks only one language. It is her mother tongue. My kids speak 3 languages fluently. After my mother's death, I streamed Sinhala movies to hear the language, though I didn't understand what they were saying. Sometimes I dream in Sinhala, but I don't know if what people are saying really makes sense. When I focus, I can hear the sound of the words in my head, but I stumble when I try to speak. It's strangely painful, like a phantom limb. Scientists say there's a process to how you lose a language. It's called first language attrition. First, you lose the words, then you lose the grammar, last, you lose the sound. But scientists don't believe the language is completely lost. A process like hypnosis, for example, might be used to help recall. Stop. I don't want my first language back. W.S. Merwin has a poem called Losing a Language. It's not about losing your first language. It's an older artist talking to a younger artist. It's a curmudgeonly poem, but I understand it. I understand the anger and the disappointment Merwin feels. Many of the things the words were about no longer exist. The children will not repeat the phrases their parents speak. My remaining family and my friends don't speak Sinhala. Learning it now will only remind me that I cannot speak it to my mother, and that my father, who had a stroke 4 years ago, cannot comprehend what I am saying. The language belongs now to a person I might have been. And when my father passes, I'll have lost the last reason to remember. Amma, Tata. And so if you want to see the artwork a bit more closely, you can go to the link. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to read a short segment. The comic is not appearing in, is not going to appear, that comic is not going to appear in Dark Tourist. It really was made, it's really a web comic. And so that's really the only platform I imagined it from. And I can also talk about that. So I imagined it for, and I can talk about that. This is essay. It's an essay that starts my collection, and I'll just read a short section of it, and then we can just talk. I'm going to share this because I love how sometimes with readings, if you're like me, I get distracted, and then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, where am I in the reading? And so this way, I like being able to share the reading, because then you can come back and not feel so dislocated. The title of the essay is Broken Arrow. And the epigraph is a segment of a poem by Louis MacNeice. No movement and no breath, no progress nor mistakes. Nothing begins or ends. No one loves or fights. All your foes are friends, and all your days are nights, and all the roads lead round and are not roads at all. 1961. On January 22nd, along the coast of North Carolina, the 8-man crew of the B-52 realizes their plane is losing fuel too fast. The right wing might be damaged, but there's no way for them to check. Only 2 members of the crew can see outside, and all that is visible to either of them is the night sky and the ocean, a purple-red bruise intersecting at the horizon. The pilot, Major Tulloch, radios Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro that the plane must make an emergency landing. This wouldn't be particularly notable, except that the Keep 19 mission is part of the Strategic Air Command, is on a test run for a program meant to allow the United States to be the first to attack in case of nuclear war. The plane carries 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear weapons, in other words, 2 hydrogen bombs. Both of these bombs together have an explosive yield 500 times greater than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, and a kill range of somewhere between 7 and 8.5 miles. Each is active, ready to detonate upon being dropped. The January night is cold, and because of a front moving through, the air at that altitude is estimated at 150 knots. A Category 1 hurricane measures winds of 62 to 82 knots. During the second midair refueling, the turbulence is so strong, Tulloch struggles to keep the plane steady. He feels every buffet and pitch in his muscles, in his bones. The cockpit of the bomber is not a comfortable place. It is all metal and glass and smells of sweat, burnt rubber, and urine. The crew has been on alert not just for the 10-hour flying time, but also before that on the ground, as they wait hours to receive their commands. They are by now simultaneously tired and wired, fueled by adrenaline and raw desire to complete the mission. At some point during the refueling, the pilot reportedly asked the co-pilot to hand fly the plane so he can rest a moment. It takes at least 3 tries to finish what should be a simple process. Flying a plane takes strength, coordination, and mental stamina under any circumstances. B-52 Stratofortresses are massive planes, 200 tons of metal, a wingspan of over 180 feet, 8 engines. In the sky, these are the hulking monsters of war movies, casting long shadows that slide menacingly across fields and mountains. On the runway, the bulk slows the bomber down and causes it to waddle as it accelerates, a motion the ground crews dubbed the elephant walk. The standard instrument panel consists of 8 throttles and 32 gauges for monitoring the engines. But I'm not being fair when I reconstruct this plane using only bolts and metal plates, tonnage and turbo power. The B-52 is surprisingly sensitive with a delicately balanced central nervous system dedicated ultimately to maintaining life. I am always shocked when I read about plane crashes, as I like to do, to realize that planes aren't built to beat nature. Nothing man-made can at an altitude of 40,000 feet, but to defy it like an extended, especially precarious game of tiddlywinks. Major Tulloch is a career soldier with the thick, beefy features of an extra in a World War II reenactment. He enlisted after Pearl Harbor at the age of 29 and has served ever since, first as a soldier and later as a fighter pilot and a test pilot. He has hundreds of hours of combat experience and has walked away from 3 test plane crashes. He is, by military standards, an old man at 46, and at least a decade and a half older than most of the crew. But he is the sort of man SAC wants flying these missions, seasoned, tough, capable. He is not afraid when the crew reports that they have lost 19 tons of fuel in little under 2 minutes. He does not imagine, as I do, some dumb dinosaur-like beast suspended high above, beyond our ken, bleeding out, slowly dying. He does not feel the frisson of excitement, that metallic taste in the tongue at the thought of some great catastrophe. He is too professional to indulge imagination. He listens instead as the Adel 57, the fuel tanker, informs him they've spotted the leak at the base of the right wing. He knows he and his crew are in some danger, though he does not know how much. He also understands that with that much fuel, with that much weight, they cannot land or the plane will break apart. They must stay aloft. He does as he is commanded. He moves the plane several hundred miles off the coast of Wilmington to prevent, if they do have to crash land, possible nuclear destruction. 1975. A few months into his first job in America at Cherry Hospital in Goldsboro, North Carolina, my father is assigned Frank Washington, a paranoid schizophrenic who everyone else in his unit is afraid of. According to my father, Frank grew up in Brooklyn and served time in New York State for assaulting a man. When the state released Frank from Sing Sing, the corrections officer gave him a bus ticket and told him to travel as far away as possible. Frank had made it to North Carolina before voices instructed him to stab a man in a bus terminal restroom. The day of his release from the North Carolina Correctional Facility, Frank refused to leave. The guards turned a high-pressure water hose on him to blast him from his cell and admitted him to Cherry Hospital because, as his court-appointed lawyer put it, you had to be crazy not to want to leave jail. Frank is a small man, lithe but powerful. He is African American. Like many of the other patients at Cherry Hospital who take little interest in their personal hygiene, he dresses in neatly kept, well-fitting clothes. The orderlies and nurses are afraid of Frank and refuse to get on an elevator alone with him, claiming he hides a shank somewhere on his body. Behind his back, they make fun of Frank's composure, call him queer. According to my father, no one else wants to take Frank on as a patient, and he doesn't really have a choice either. I wonder when my father tells me this, if he wasn't assigned Frank as some sort of punishment. My father, all his life, has elicited from others respect for his intelligence and competence, and the desire to put him in his place. The latter he brings on himself. He is charming, but also quick-tempered, often rude and abrasive with little warning. During the patient interview, my father watches Frank closely. Frank is calm, almost listless, and he doesn't make eye contact. He is 38, making him and my father close to each other in age. But this man, before my father, is alone, with any family long ago lost to him, and very ill. He keeps his hands on the table in front of him, where everyone else can see them, another sign of life spent in institutions. My father asked Frank if he knows what the following proverb means: a watched pot never boils. Frank takes a long time to respond. When he finally does, he speaks to the corner of the room. He explains that if you watch a pot, the water won't boil. This isn't an indication of the man's intelligence, but a symptom instead of his disease. He prefers, perhaps can only comprehend, the literal. His mind cannot contend with the deeper figurative meaning. My father notes the response on the patient's chart. When he looks back, he's distracted momentarily by some feeling of sorrow. He isn't supposed to be here, he thinks. He is here by accident. He's very well prepared and very ambitious. He left Sri Lanka in the early 70s to complete a prestigious fellowship in England. He was supposed to arrive in a new world, but this world, rendered barren by the cool October wind, looks anything but new. The fields with their hardened dark earth and desiccated corn stalks are used and unpromising. Cherry Hospital feels worn and tired with its decades-old brick buildings. In movies, on television, American hospitals had looked bright, all white, with young, attractive nurses and doctors. Cherry Hospital reeks with ammonia and mildew. Frank complains of pain in his arm and shoulder. Last week, my father and Frank had a lively conversation about boxing. Both were boxers in their youth and they bonded over their shared interest. But Frank isn't lively today. This might be the pain, it might be the Haldol. Frank begins to explain that the pain is caused by radio waves emitted by a transmitter at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. This is a man whose brain has splintered, a brain that doesn't properly process sensory information. It doesn't process social cues. Frank's victim at the bus terminal may have taunted him, or he may have smiled. I learned all this during a series of interviews I conduct with my father for a novel that I never published. My father also explains to me that the lawyer was wrong. Frank wasn't crazy for not wanting to leave jail. According to my father, mentally ill patients often seek the comfort and shelter of a rigorously structured environment. It eases the confusion and disorientation. My father speaks solemnly. His expression is one of compassion. Frank is the only patient my father has ever spoken about to me. Frank stays with him and bothers him. He is one of the reasons that my father, who became certified to practice both psychiatry and general medicine, decided to leave psychiatry and build instead an internal medicine practice. I don't know why, out of the hundreds of patients my father treated in his 40-year career, Frank stays with him. He does reveal Frank's complete diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia due to socio-cultural deprivation. We thought it was a joke, my father says to me. By we, he means his colleagues at the hospital, many who were immigrants as well. The diagnoses we were making, socio-cultural deprivation, we'd never heard of that diagnosis in England. I'm going to stop there. I think that's a good place to stop.
We can do some, we can take off mute, we can take the mute off and give some claps, should we? Thank you so much. Great piece. It's lovely and chilling and perfect for today. Wonderful to hear your voice. Thank you so much. Let's chat with Hasanthika for a little while. What would you like to say or ask? I have questions, but I'd love to hear from you all first.
I guess I kind of have a question about like the comic strips. Did you create those pictures?
Yes. Yeah. Did.
Awesome.
I did. I actually have a degree in visual. My original training, I trained for a long time as a studio artist, and I have a degree in visual art, my undergraduate. So, and then I switched to words, and then now I try to go between both. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Hasanthika, are you making, do you have a history? I love that piece and I'm so glad to hear you read it. The graphic piece, do you have a series of those? Will you make more? Do you have a history of making those kinds of works? And if not, what drove you to create the story in that medium? Can you talk a little bit about moving across mediums?
I can. I'm happy to, and this might be of interest to all of you, because I believe you're all creative writing students, and maybe you're also, some of you are, sounds like you're visual artists as well. I enjoyed comics as when I was young. I loved the actually, people always ask me whether I'm Marvel or DC fan. I like the EC. I liked Tales of the Crypt a lot. So I was really odd, I think. And you know, comics, I think, you know, a lot of people, I think a lot of immigrants love comics because it's a way on some level to interface with the culture and also to learn English. But I also actually I really enjoyed comics because they always felt so transgressive to me. And I even as, you know, as a queer woman, I think I had already kind of, I didn't know I was queer at 12, but you know, I'd already kind of had this real interest in works that really sort of like pushed the boundaries of. And so I mean, I don't think my work is particularly transgressive, but I had an interest in that. And so I think I loved comics, but I never thought of comics as something that I could do because I came out of a really kind of snobbish studio art system that was very into kinds of things like training people to learn proper perspective and to draw in a kind of mimetic way. And so my interest in comics has been actually very recent. And I would do more comics, but they're really hard to work on. They take not just, I mean, they just take a lot of time. So just to give you some idea, one of those panels would have taken me probably somewhere altogether, probably around 8 to 12, and that's a soft estimate, 8 to 12 hours to draw. And that's what's weird about a comic is that it looks like it doesn't, like, you know, they don't look like they take that long to draw, but those actually, if you looked at them closer, you could see they're fairly detailed. And so you know, that is very labor intensive. And I remember drawing it and thinking, okay, I could have written this paragraph in like in 10 minutes, right? I could have made this a paragraph, it could be 10 minutes. And I actually have been, and I'm getting more now, I kind of, on my comics, I'm very lucky, I guess, to have kind of, I don't have to go through the ranks of cartoonists, which, you know, I think there's so many amazing cartoonists. I kind of get people asking me just because I've done a couple, asking me to do comics. And so I've been commissioned to do a comic for the Georgia Review. But, you know, this is really, it's a 4-page comic and it's taking me now, like, you know, easily 6 weeks just to sit and draw. And it's a review, actually, it's a graphic review. If I were doing this prose, that review I would write it in 3 hours, right? And so I'm like, why am I drawing this review? And so, but the reason that I'm doing it is because I've been very, and I think Trini, you are the same. I'm very interested in finding different ways to tell story. And comics actually ask you, we have a tendency, I think, to really misunderstand genres and forms and really see things as simple when they aren't. And comics actually ask something really complicated of the reader, which is to really follow the comic in 3 separate tracks. And this is not just an invention of mine. There's a very famous theorist who works in, and that's her name, Hilary Shute, who works in the theory of comics and graphic novels, and she's extraordinary. And I'm looking down because I have one of her books on the floor, which is where I keep all my books somehow, not in bookshelves. And so I, you know, she talks about this. There's the track of the script, and then there's the track of the visual. And if you look at a book like Fun Home, which some of you may have read, there's a very different story being told from the prose versus the visual. And and in order to really comprehend the beauty and the power of Fun Home, you really have to be reading both simultaneously. And yeah, and so and it's quite extraordinary what Alison Bechdel is able to accomplish, and very, very moving when she asks you to, she's really asking you to comprehend and see 2 different states of being. One is the story and her anger towards her father, and another is the story of her father. And so I was trying for something like that with about losing my language. And I was drawn to this because I don't feel like the essay form is a natural fit for comics. Comics are good for sort of kind of classic narratives or memoir, which can allow for some temporal, which memoir really depends on some level on playing with temporality. But essays are something else completely. And so I was very, very interested in seeing if I could make a comic fit the essay. I don't know if, I'll admit to Trini, I don't know if it's completely successful, but I'm also interested in failures. And I don't think you learn until you actually are allowed to fail. And yeah, so we'll go from there. Sorry, I can really talk.
That's great. There are so many things to pull apart, and I do want to pursue some of those lines in our class visit after this. But I was thinking about that shifting between, and then William, well, you're up next. But quick follow up. Shifting between the image and the text and how it invites you to do multiple things at the same time. It is like it's using that skill that you spoke about in the essay, our figurative language capabilities and the neurocognitive part of our brains, which allows us to understand subtext, for example, right?
Right.
But if you have two different things happening and you're asked to compare them as they're happening simultaneously, like storytelling does this all the time, and image text does that all the time too, right? Let's look.
Absolutely. I actually wanted just to point to, so
Yeah.
this panel here, in this case, those of you who know comics know that when you don't have this, when you don't have the tag, that means that it's being spoken off the frame.
Mm-hmm.
And so, or the panel in this case, I should use the right comic term, but I was using a movie term for a second. But and so what that means essentially is that implies that the reader is saying this to the little girl and to the mother, right? And so there's no way for me to do that really in an essay, right? Is to implicate the reader in the kind of in this process. And I actually didn't realize the impact of that until I'd read this at BCFA, and two of our faculty members, Connie and Ellen, and you know that I know the audience, most of you won't know who that is, but Trini does, both came back to me and said that this image of the little girl, who isn't me, by the way, it's my niece, really, just hit them powerfully. And I just thought I love this idea of, in my story, also, like if you read this as a work of prose, you'd imagine a little girl in that position that you'd invented. But I love the idea, I think this is part of Fun Home as well, of allowing myself to be, to also control the image that the reader is creating as a way of keeping my story, in this case, a story that's really important to me, of keeping that story really embodied within my own experience.
That's great. Thank you. William, did you have your hand up?
I did. I just had a question.
Yes, thank you.
So going back to the comic thing, where did you submit it?
I pitched Electric Literature. I knew somebody at the time who was an editor there, and I said, I have a web comic, and she goes, okay. Because there's a lot of, for those of you who are artistically inclined, and by the way, again, sorry, Trini, I know I'm about to say something that you know really well, but you actually don't have to be able to draw. This is what drew me to, sorry for the unintentional pun there, but this is what sort of attracted me to comics, is that I've become also really interested recently in what makes something good or what makes something bad aesthetically. And what I really admire about cartooning is that they have always been really pushing what constitutes a good drawing. And, you know, Linda Barry, who is a really great cartoonist and who I admire a great deal. And, oh, sorry, that's not right. Is it a Y or an I, Trini, do you know?
I
Linda
think it's a
Barry?
Y. Yeah, you had it. You just-
Okay, so,
yeah.
so, oh yeah, there you go, thanks. And so, you know, she has really done a lot of fantastic work in really making cartooning and comics accessible and really questioning what an idea of a drawing is. And so a lot of people tell me, oh, I can't draw. And I'm like, well, you're the perfect cartoonist then, because it's not just about doing a great drawing. You do have to have some visual sense, visual composition sense. So all that to say, if any of you are at all inclined to do comics, there's a real hunger out there. It's particularly for web comics. Electric Literature is always looking, The Believer magazine, there's a bunch of places. And it's a nice way, I think, to get your work out there. Yeah.
Very true.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I have a question. I have a thought. I'm going to mull it over aloud while I'm forming.
Yeah, those are the best.
Going to work it out. Okay, so I was thinking about the sequencing, the choice of those two readings back to back, and the father figure, and the expectations that he brings to the family in the first piece with his usage of language and when and where, and then the expectations he brings to his casework and to his decisions to share information with the narrator. So both pieces felt like tribute, and also like looking back into memory to consider how and when people decide to share information with us, especially parents, right? Loved ones. Why are they telling us this? Why Frank? Why this person, right? Like what is it because they need to share? Like what are the motivations of that exchange, right? And it felt like the reading was very much about that, but it was also really interesting to think about watching the essay roll by on the page, since you had shown, and that was, you know, an interesting choice to share on a visual reading. We get to see the words roll by since we had just seen the graphic comic. And I really enjoyed that because it reminded me one thing that I love about your work, and maybe you could speak a little to this, and then maybe we'll hop off and move to class, is the sharp eye for, I think of it as an accuracy, but I didn't say that in the introduction. I don't think it's a helpful word unless I know what I'm talking about there. There's a selection of character detail. You're really good at deciding when and where to include, to jump out of a scene or a moment and include a character detail, right? So for example, when father is describing his patient, and then there's a moment about temperament, or later on, just back to the main plot, and then a character detail about, you know, like in the comic, like what you said, it jumps out and speaks directly in the classroom setting to describe what happens in assimilation when people lose their language. So can you talk about, is there any, I know that's just an organic decision that you're making, but do you have a gut instinct of like when to jump out of a moment and describe a character or add a moment in here and there, that regardless of genre, right?
I really appreciate that, and that's such a beautiful thing, and thank you. And I very much appreciate that coming from you, Trini. You know, it's, so I think one of the things that does happen when you choose to do something like a comic for a situation that's as complex as losing a language, that one of the things I can't do is talk about the aftermath, which maybe I would have been able to do in a prose essay. But it's not as if I started speaking only English, and then everybody was like, "Oh, your English is wonderful." I started speaking English, and then I was just constantly criticized. And I still, to this day, feel the slag when I speak. I don't know, some people out there might have similar experiences, but I remember reading about Edward Said. He spoke, technically he spoke Arabic and English fluently, but he says, I never felt comfortable in either language. And so I was very quiet as a child because I just felt if I opened my mouth, I would, thank you, Trini, I would, someone would have something to say about how I was, how I shouldn't be speaking this, or I wasn't saying this properly. And so I was very, very quiet. And I think that made me be more observant. I don't want to say I'm very observant because every day I miss something important. But I think, it does kind of, that sort of outsider feeling kind of makes me, I have a feeling so many of you really identify with that feeling. And, you become very watchful. And I, to this day, I'm talking a lot right now. That's because I'm very comfortable with Trini, but I tend to be sort of quiet in social situations. But I think as far as the detail goes, I think that part of it is maybe the art training and that sort of life of, if you're quiet, then you sort of become more watchful, and you're also watching for opportunities and when you should speak. And then, and also I think, and this goes to all of you broadly and sort of as craft advice, I've thought more and more of setting as being the first craft element, just because of the huge impact setting has on who we are as people, and how we just can't separate our behaviors out of the time and place and the pressure of that. And our, and by place, I don't just mean setting as in a landscape, but setting as in the systems and the cultures and the political arenas of any space. And setting, I think one of the things that you learn when you teach setting is that setting is essentially an essentializing force. We come into a setting and we trade in stereotypes and in quick judgments of things and people. I think a lot about this living out in central Pennsylvania and the ways in which I have traded in stereotypes of rural, white, poor. And I think as a writer, we have to really push against, use setting in our knowledge and our observation to really push against that essentializing force. I think it's a moral duty, and because, and especially for the world and the time that we live in, it's your job. And so if you want to do this, it's your job then to be willing to see it, and see it not with your judgments already formed, because it's easy for me to walk out here as a person of color and as someone's queer and make very quick judgments about how someone is interacting with me and say that they're racist and they're homophobic. Because you know what? Sometimes, many times, most of the time, that is true. But no, but it is. But also that there's a more complicated, there's a more complicated situation behind all that. And that, and those, three things, racist and homophobic and, classist and others are also essentializing terms. And so I think it's very, very, sorry, I'm going to get very kind of, sorry, the teacher in me is going to kick in, but the root of the essay is in both a sort of aesthetic sense of the essay, and then also a kind of the essay as a science, in the science of empiricism, of observing the world. That was what, Francis Bacon, who's this extraordinary English essayist, he thought the essay was a science because it could capture the world empirically. And so, Trinita, that's a long way, and maybe quite a little bit of a lot pretentious way of answering your question about why I think it is really, really a moral imperative. And I really, truly hate, I'm not sure, Trini, you know me well enough to know, I actually hate it when people say things like moral imperative. I'm like, oh, whatever. But I think given the rates at which good writing is disappearing, the rates at which what's replacing it is a kind of a content machine that's really driven by this idea of clicking on it so that you can read something outrageous and feel outraged. And how many times I think, wow, there are real human beings behind this, and if you'd thought to observe for a second, you would have done something so much more meaningful, but you wouldn't have gotten the click that you wanted. Sorry, Trini, I got on a soapbox. I apologize.
That's okay. I took some notes that I hope we can bring into our class visit. This has been really super important and something that we're talking about when we, especially in relationship to building world rendering and fantasy work and in imagination, the importance of rendering worlds and what that is and what that means. So if we could have a kind of mini lesson in that, and you and I can brainstorm about that and get everyone going in class, let's do it.
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah. Well, everybody, let's give a round of applause and say some thank yous, shout out some thanks. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're so excited to continue the conversation with you. And thank you for your beautiful reading. And
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Trini. I didn't mean to talk.
No, go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. I know this is your lunchtime. It's actually really deeply meaningful to me that you took the time to come to this. And so thank you, everybody. It's real honors, absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, do you
I'll click off and click the other link. Is that right?
Yeah, let's pop off. We'll take a stretch and
right.
Take a 10-minute stretch and we'll see each other in a few. Okay,
Perfect.
in class.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.